Okay, it's time to talk about the clock. And, everyone's least favorite part of Warhammer and why we have to use clocks or we don't, or what the different philosophies are on using a clock. A lot of intermediate players step into the competitive scene and their first time playing on a clock or taints the experience for them and they just hate it from then on. Um, so I'm just going to kind of walk through the philosophies on clocks, why they're used, and then try and give y'all some tools to be able to use a clock well and avoid those feel bad experiences that can arise based on time in Warhammer. Um, so first, why is a clock used? Without a clock, and for a while in Warhammer, um, when you would go to a tournament, there would be set round times, but not necessarily, um, there wouldn't be a clock where time was divided between opponents. So what would happen is if players ran out of time during a game, uh, the score would have to stand where it was. Where if you get to round three and you run out of time, whatever the score is in round three is what you have to submit if you can't figure it out with your opponent. Um, and this can obviously cause some pretty feels bad moments if your opponent runs an army that is focused on pressuring you, and so for the first two turns of the game they throw their whole army at you, and on turn three you table them and they're dead, and you look at the table and your opponent has like one unit in their back line, and then you run out of time on the clock, and your opponent goes, well, guess we gotta score it where it stands. That feels terrible. It is unpleasant, and it happens every tournament that does not enforce clocks. You will see that happen, and if it has not happened to you, and you don't actively play on a clock, then I am sure it will happen to you in the future, because and even in games where it's not that actively hostile, but in situations where you've killed most of your opponent's army and you think to yourself like, I'm certainly going to win from here, your opponent maybe thinks like, I have play lines, I've got maneuvers that I can do to scrape points. um, there's just no, if you disagree, then there's no way for a TO or a judge to help resolve that beyond just, hey, we gotta let it stand as it does. So people got annoyed at this because there would be people who would play armies who take advantage of it. There were people who and are currently people who will craft armies specifically to take advantage of the clock, and will take advantage of not having a clock, right? And will take advantage of the fact that as long as you take a good amount of time and you don't finish the round, you don't need to like win all five rounds. You just need to win a few, which is really frustrating for a lot of people. So what um, they what they came up with instead was the introduction of a chess clock, which splits the round timer evenly between both players, and you pass time back and forth as it counts down. For a 3-hour round, you get an hour and a half each. It counts down, and once um, that clock hits zero, you are not allowed to do any game actions. So you can roll saves, and if you score secondaries by just standing somewhere, like behind enemy lines or engaged on all fronts or area denial, then you can score those. Anything else you can't do. So you cannot, roll um, you can't declare an action if you have 0 seconds left on your clock, and all you have to do is say, I cleanse with those units. You can't do that. That's a game action. and you have to just kind of let it stand as it does. You can't move anything, you can't roll any attacks, you can't roll any abilities, you can't new orders, draw a new secondary. None of that is on the table once you run out of time. Um, Throughout the game, you are expected to pass the clock back and forth. So it's counting down in your time when you are taking an active, when you are the active player. And what that means is you are the active player anytime your opponent is prevented from moving on while you are like doing something. Um, and not necessarily like they can go do stuff and do stuff on your time, but that's not allowed. Like you shouldn't be doing that. Theoretically you could, like while you're the active player, but the main point is like if you are resolving the next step, if you are rolling a save, or if you are reactive moving or moving anything in your opponent's turn, you should switch to yourself if you are the one taking that action, and your opponent should wait to do anything else until um, you are set to be done. And then in your turn, you are keeping the time on you unless your opponent is interrupting you. If your opponent goes, wait, I might, let me think, time goes on them while they think. um, Same with deployment. If you should take turns during deployment and should not um, deploy in your opponent's time, because then you get more time than your opponent at the end of the day, right? Because you both deployed one unit, but you did it during your opponent's time, so then you get more time later. This is all the rules of the clock. This is what should be done according to the rules laid out in clock guides, the generally accepted way of using a clock. Um, so what is the kind of different philosophies from tournament organizers? This is kind of the enforcement um, list of the different ways that a tournament can use a clock. The first is that clocks can be enforced upon request. This is, I would say, a lot of large tournaments. If you opt to use a clock, if you say if either player at the table says I would like to use a clock, then a clock is required and enforced by the judge at the end of the game. It can also be always enforced. Certain tournaments, especially at the high level like WTC, require all players to play on the clock. This can also be, it can switch mid-tournament, so it can be enforced upon request until you get to the top tables. And then for the last, 16 undefeated players, they always have to play on a clock. But those, you are expected and required to play on one. The tournament will provide a clock if you don't have one in a lot of cases, although a lot of players do have a clock of their own because they prefer to play on time. The other type is what Games Workshop tournaments will do. JBU Opens and Worlds will use clocks that are enforced if behind schedule. What this means is that judges will be kind of walking through the hall and will double check with players on all the different tables as the game proceeds. Announcements will be called, hey, you should be on round 2 right now, on round 3. And if a judge asks you where you're at and you're behind schedule, or if you are behind schedule and you go actively find a judge, they can put you on a clock and divide the remaining time between the two players, and then from then on the clock is enforced. And if a clock was put on the table at the beginning of the game by a player, it is not enforced. And then the last is just clocks aren't enforced. This is moving, this used to be kind of a Games Workshop thing, but for the most part, I think most tournaments will enforce a clock as long as the player, is communicative about it. So there are different pros and cons to each of these. enforced upon request means that the players that know they want it can play on it, but they could um, force their opponent who's unfamiliar with time to play on a clock and take advantage of that potentially. Always to enforce time could mean that two opponents that feel they have no need for a clock um, could have to play on one and track their time and have an extra in-game thing that they have to do that they otherwise wouldn't want to. Enforced behind schedule has a lot of negatives. The so the downside of doing this is that it has the same downside as not playing on a clock, but slightly mitigated in that a player taking a long time on the front end of the game is going to get more time and is going to limit a some players' ability to finish the game. So if I uh, am playing a army that takes a long time in the front of the game, and I send a lot of units forward and get aggressive with them and spend a lot of the clock, and then the TO or the judge notices that we're 45 minutes behind schedule, and then they split the time. They split the time evenly, even though my opponent hasn't done as much. The other thing that will happen is that they aren't good about placing a clock and splitting it evenly at the start of the battle round. So sometimes I could go turn one, my opponent does turn one, I do turn two, and then they notice we're behind schedule and they put us on a clock. And I have gotten 2 turns not on a clock. My opponent needs to now play 4 turns in the same time that I get to play 3, which is not ideal. This The reason why Games Workshop does enforce behind schedule clocks is that if their philosophy as a whole is that certain armies take more time than others, and if the game can be finished in time, then they would prefer that an army not be punished for taking more time than another one, just because X army takes an hour 40 to play. If Y army takes just an hour, they don't want the first army to be punished, which I can respect, but it does come with the downsides that I mentioned before. So it's my opinion that that's not worth it, but I guess I understand why they do it. This There kind of ends up being different philosophies from player perspective as well. So this is like how it's enforced. Generally, with these sort of things, if players talk out for any of the ones where the clock is not enforced, if any players talk out around, um, judges are expected to be there in most cases. That's usually in a player pack these days, because otherwise someone could get taken advantage of, or someone could get kind of hand wavy with the score being talked out based on time, and so usually they ask judges to be there at the table. The different player perspectives, these are the ones that I've kind of laid out, but it is a shade of gray for sure. I would say that the first is easiest, and that some players prefer not to play on a clock. They don't like that aspect of Warhammer, and they don't think that it should be a part of the game. Another type of player will not, the next 3 are assuming that they are playing on a clock. They won't enforce it if the game can be finished. So, hey, I have 20 minutes left, you just ran out of time, but we're both in round 5. Let's just finish this game and score it up how it'll happen. And then another player might not enforce their clock if a game can be talked out. So, hey, we're both in round 4, but I think it's super obvious what's happening here. I'm losing, and even though you ran out of time, it's like there's no way I could possibly come back and score, so let's just talk out some scores and it's fine. They are only going to enforce the clock if a players ran out of time and it is unclear who would win. The last one I have listed as time as a resource. This is a type of player who believes that there isn't a way that the game can feel good. There's always like ways that the game can feel bad unless time is treated as a resource that both players have. If a player can't play under time with a list, they should play a different list. If they run out of time in a game, then they have misallocated their resources and have lost the game. It is to them, and to this type of player, it is a understanding that we are playing this game in this X amount of time. We each have an hour 30. If you can't play under that time, regardless of board state, like that is also a requirement to win. You also have to use your time wisely. Just because you spent all your time at the beginning and ran out of it, and just because I was really efficient with my time doesn't mean I have to give you my time so that you can continue beating me. You used all your time at the beginning to make really smart, super thought out choices, which then now you have ran out of time and you did not carefully think that out, and unfortunately it means that you've lost. People can disagree with that, but it is a completely valid way of thinking about the game, and it is true that any other one of these philosophies has feels bad moments that can come out of it, where there isn't a good way to talk out the game, or there isn't a good way to finish the game, and someone will get clocked, regardless, or the clock won't be applied, and it'll feel really bad. So these are kind of the different philosophies that a player can have. What is really important at the beginning of each game is that you establish with your opponent which philosophy you follow. If you're playing on a clock specifically, but if clocks are allowed, you should tell your opponent, this is how I usually play on a clock, and give your opponent the opportunity to provide the same grace to you so that you can understand from the starting point the level of care that you should have towards a clock. In general, I would say that it's best for you to care about the clock to the level that you would playing against someone who is a time is a resource player in all instances. But it doesn't feel good if you are assuming that your opponent and you are playing to a place where you can talk it out, and then your opponent out of nowhere goes, oh yeah, and so your clock is out and I win. And so you should, it is the expectation, and it should be an expectation, this is part of playing by intent in my opinion, to tell your opponent how you play at the start of the game so that your opponent knows what they should expect should it happen, and it'll help decrease that feels bad moment of, oh, you're just gonna clock me because I'm out of time, versus, oh yeah, you did say at the beginning that this is how it's played, it stinks, but I am out of time, so good game. That is, I think, really important to do for everyone. It also stops people from saying, oh, yeah, in their head, they're like, I'm a talk out player, but then they don't say it, and then they get to the end of the game and they're like, well, this is my first tournament that I've ever gotten this far, and I could win if I do time as a resource, so I'm going to do that, because I haven't established what I wanted to do before. And you can get you can have a bad time because of that, so you should kind of give your opponent the opportunity to establish as well, so you can have a good game. Okay, there are different responsibilities. If you are playing on a clock, here are my expectations for what you should be doing to have the best game of Warhammer that you can. The first is notifying your opponent when you switch the clock. This is, in my opinion, the single most important thing, and can lead to the worst feeling in clock management if this does not happen, which is when you switch the time to the opponent, you should say verbally, I am passing time to you, or passing clock is the simplest, shortest way to say it. because if your opponent is unaware that time has been passed to them, and then they finish, and then you move on and you forget, then you we can just let time run on them, and you realize 10 minutes later, oh crap, we forgot about the clock, and now we have no idea how long it's been running on your time. I guess let it run on mine for a little bit. I don't know how long, and it can just feel really bad because one player thinks, I know you let it run on my time for way longer than you should have, and there's just no way of reconciling that. So you by notifying your opponent every time you switch the clock, it gives both players the opportunity to recognize when it's time to switch that time back to the active player, back to yourself, because your opponent is aware of it and you are aware of it, and so when it's time to go and you finish whatever your opponent's doing, you can switch the time to you. And what that kind of ties into the next thing, which is that your responsibility is to actively switch time to yourself. If you recognize that your opponent has finished a thing and you are doing stuff and you notice that the time is on your opponent, this should be obvious, but it is your responsibility, and it should be your responsibility to switch the time back to yourself. At the end of the day, for enforcement purposes, it is like a TO can't enforce this. There's no good way for a TO to enforce the fact that, hey, my opponent let it run on my time. What should we do? The TO can't do anything. So from an enforcement perspective, each player is responsible for their own time. From a playing Warhammer at the table in a community perspective, your responsibility is to actively switch time to yourself if you notice it not being on you. Don't take advantage of the fact that a TO can't enforce it. The other thing is, I would say that your responsibility is to always switch time to the active player. This is primarily about the fact that some players will have different expectations about when they should switch time. Intermediate players you'll run into might say things like, "You're really going to switch it to me every time I make a save," or "You're really going to switch to me when I'm thinking," or stuff like that. And it's like, yes, because when we get to turn 5 and we're low on time, we're definitely going to be doing that. And if you're taking a long time to do these things, even if you're not, like, we should just be playing the game on our time. And when I do it, for quick actions, I'll go put my hand on one, flip it to them, and then just leave my hand on top of the paddle to pass it back to myself until they're done. It's really short, but it also it stops you from letting the time run on someone else's time. If you are being really active about switching it back and forth, you are checking the clock more often and more likely to catch the clock running on the wrong person sooner, to prevent the feels bad moment of we forgot about the clock and it sucked up a lot of time from a player who shouldn't have had that time used. This is along with the responsibility of notifying your opponent at the beginning of the game what type of player you are on a clock. The you know the, these three I think are very important. If you decide that this is not how you want to play, specifically the last one where you are not switching it to the active player, you don't think that that's worth doing, just stick to it, I guess. Because if you get to the end of the game and things are awkward, you just don't want that to backfire. And generally, I would say that you should stick to your beliefs, regardless of situation, for both this and like what type of clock player you are. You should establish in your mind how you want to play and not change it based on the game or your opponent. Although I will say that if I know that my opponent is a known time as a resource player who gets their opponent, every time when they run out of time, I certainly am going to be a lot more on my time, and I'm going to enforce the clock as well. If I know my opponent's like way of playing is usually more concrete, and they have won games because their opponent, they've taken advantage of that. Not taken advantage because it's not necessarily a bad thing, but have won games because of the clock. I certainly am not going to let them get away with winning a game out, just like talking something out, right? If they are hardline clock player, they don't get to change their mind about that when they play me, and it becomes more convenient to them. And so you like people shouldn't do that in general. But like you are, I hope that makes sense. The player advantages. So the clock can advantage different players in different ways. Uh, if you go first, you will use less time on turn one because usually your opponent's resources are hiding, and so all you do is stage, step on some objectives. You don't really shoot a whole lot, and it's pretty chill. Um, and then your opponent has to respond to that, and so often they will take more time on their turn one on bottom of one. But at the end of the game, you are going to take more time on turn five because on turn five, the player who goes second doesn't really need to shoot anything unless a secondary is relevant. They don't need to worry about removing resources just for removing resources' sake. They just need to step on circles, do secondaries, and call it a day, and so that often will take a lot less time. What this can mean is that a player who goes first and aggressively pushes, if they run out of time early enough that both players run out of time and the score has to be called where it stands, that player who goes first is at an advantage. However, if the player who goes second runs out of time second and saves like 3 minutes on their clock, they can just do game actions and nothing else for all the turns that they want. What this means is that they have the capability to say, okay, in round three you ran out of time, player who goes first. Well, I have 3 minutes left on my clock, so my turn three is going to be 1 minute of me stepping onto the objectives and scoring secondaries. My turn four is going to be 1 minute of me standing where I am and scoring secondaries, and my turn five is going to be the same. And you don't get to do anything because you ran out of time. This is why generally, if you are playing on a clock and you run out of time early, you just kind of lose unless you have so much tabled your opponent, or it's like turn five. You there's not a whole lot that you can do. What the best practice is for someone who is playing on a clock is to make sure, if you are going first or second, honestly, if you are going any turn, if you are playing the game of Warhammer on a clock, you should save a few minutes, even if you don't get to do the things that you wanted to do on your turn. There should be at the end of each turn, preferably a minute or two, preferably 2 minutes per turn, just to like stand somewhere to say, I'm doing cleanse. Because if you think too much about like, I've got to finish my turn three, and to do my turn three, I got to shoot this and shoot that and shoot this, so that I get my bring it down for 4 points, and you do that on turn three and you sacrifice the rest of your time to do it, then on turn four and five, you can't like move a unit that takes 5 seconds to move, step on an objective to score 5 points, or declare I'm cleansing and score 5 points. You'll give up more by making sure that you get your last shot in. So if you realize if you're in turn four and you have 2 minutes left, you should just like end your turn, say, dang it, I don't have enough time to shoot that thing. I'm going to be done because I need to have time left on my clock to just move a thing and say I'm cleansing. The other thing that's relevant for players to know about clocks is that certain armies are affect the clock in different ways. The natural instinct is to expect that players with more models are going to take more time on the clock. And this isn't untrue, but it is also true that players, if you are playing against a player who has a lot of models, you will also take more time. The thing that causes more time is rolling more dice and moving more things. For the player who's running all the models, moving more things is true, but often they don't have to roll as many dice because they only have to roll saves, whereas the opponent has to roll attacks and hits, or like amount of attacks, hits, wounds, and re-rolls against their whole army. It's a lot more dice, and it's a lot more to take care of. And so the swarm armies I would say generally will find that their opponent is running at a time more often than they are. That does not mean that it should be taken advantage of to win. It should be something that you make your opponent aware of and assist them with acting, as you notice that they're, performing behind schedule, give them, let them know, help them play faster because and play on a clock yourself to try and still finish the game of Warhammer as best you can, because I do think that that should be the general goal, is to have as good a feeling game as possible with your opponent as well, as attempting to win. So keep them in the loop. So let's talk a little bit at the end here about kind of what my opinion is on these types of player philosophies, kind of where I stand. The first is that I would say any of the bottom three. My first is that you should play on a clock generally. If you have not experienced a opponent like you running out of time, knowing that your opponent took 2 of the 3 hours to play the game, and yet they still are like, well, we ran out of time and we can't talk it out, and I'm tabled, but I've got 53 and you've got 47, so I win. If you haven't experienced that and you think that wouldn't happen, it will happen to you once, and you will go, I think I might want to play on a clock, because it feels so bad to win a game and your opponent just like slow plays you into them getting the win, even though you have outgeneraled them, and you also know that you played the game faster. So play on a clock. I land on this third row, but in that I won't enforce a clock if a game can be talked out. But I don't think that should be the expectation. That is not the best way to do it, and if someone plays as time as a resource, or if game can be finished, that is not a bad thing for them to do. I fully respect people saying, I just think that the way that the game is played is each player gets half the time, and you should play it out, and you should learn to play well on time. Makes sense to me, and in that way, it's really important to me to respect that, and if they request that, I'm matching that energy 100% so that we can both have a good game. But if and I'm not being like, oh, you're going to be like that. That's not the way you should do it. If you run out of time, it's a bummer, but you ran out of time, and your opponent, like, you should have asked at the beginning, or your opponent should have told you at the beginning that that's how they're playing, and so you know from the start that's what you're signing up for. For me, it's personally, especially, and I will say at WTC, at the highest levels, I switched to becoming a time as a resource player because we're playing at the highest levels. But that, even at like a single super major, at a GW Open in the final round, I will play like this. I will not enforce a game. Well, GW doesn't have good clocks, but FLG. I won't, you know, if my opponent runs out of time and I'm lost and there's not a way for me to get back into it, I will give them the win anyway, because I prefer to play my games of Warhammer more about generalship than time management, and I don't want to punish my opponent for not saving a couple minutes or something like that. It's just not a fun way for me to win. But I also understand that by doing this, I leave myself open to situations. At one of my early tournaments, I had a situation where we were playing on a clock. My opponent ran out of time. He was like, "Can we try to talk it out?" And I was like, "I mean, we can. I have 10 minutes left on my clock. You have 0. So if we can't, And I guess I didn't properly specify, like, if we can't, I win. And in doing so, my opponent, we talked out, spent the last 10 minutes of the round trying to talk it out on my time, and then we ran out of time, and so then my opponent was like, well, I guess we can't talk it out, we gotta score it while it stands, and I'm up 3. And I was like, what? No, I had the time left on my clock. If we can't talk it out, then I would have just won, because I could have just walked in all the circles and you can't do anything. but I wasn't clear on the onset with my opponent about that being how I like think about the game. And if you run out of, or if your opponent runs out of time, and the and you try to talk it out, your you should be clear before doing that that if you can't agree, you win. You need them to agree to that, because if they don't agree to that, you get to go, sorry, then I don't think we can talk it out. I'm just going to move on all these circles because, well, why would I, that's you at the end of the day did not use your time correctly. And if we can't talk it out in a way that makes us both feel good, there's not a point in just letting you win because you used less time or used more time. So that's my opinion. This is not a this is just something that makes games generally, I think, feel better. It avoids the worst case. Yeah, for new players, maybe it feels a little bit of a bummer to have to play on it, but it avoids some of the worst feelings in 40k. And in general, if you do not play on a clock, this is the last point I will make. If you do not play on a clock and you opt out of a clock, it is your responsibility if the round is over and you know who would win, or even like you're pretty sure that your opponent will win. It is your responsibility to let them win even if you are up on score. In my opinion, I think that should be the expectation in our community, because it's one of my least favorite things to see two people not play on a clock and then their opponent, someone's opponent goes, well, you would definitely win if we had all the time to play this whole thing out. But unfortunately, we don't. We have to call it where it stands, and I'm winning, so I will take the win. And it's like, okay, if you know who would have won, then you should let them win. And the win should be given to them, because you don't know if you took more time or your opponent took more time because you didn't play on a clock. If you aren't going to use the clock, then you can't use time as a leverage to win, because that's just in my opinion, a scummy thing to do. If I'm happy to talk about this, as always, with anyone. If you have questions or comments, feel free to ask about them. But this is, I think, an important thing to have kind of locked in your belt, and to know and have on your mind as you play. You are also going to generally play faster on a clock than if you aren't, even if you don't need it, even if you never end up using it. Being aware of time makes you play faster, which is more kind and considerate to your opponents. So it is something I encourage you to try more and to keep an open mind about, and then just do your best to encourage you and your opponent to have a great time, and I'm sure it'll be good regardless. But if you disagree, feel free to say something, and I'll respond maybe. All right, thanks.